So, about a year and a half ago, something caught my eye on Facebook Marketplace. Now, I don't own a farm. I don't even own enough land to justify owning a tractor, not even close. But I'd been tossing around the idea of buying one. It had to be small. There's only so much room with only so much I could do with it on my half-acre lot. So I need to be able to move it around in order to actually use it. And I don't own a semi or a low bed, just a mid-sized pickup and a single axle trailer. So when I saw an ad come up for an old Kubota B7000, I took some serious interest. Spoiler alert, I did end up buying it. In the time since, I've learned quite a bit about it. I'm not a mechanic by trade. I actually work in IT, but my dad was a mechanic, so I grew up around engines and oil and grease and moving parts. And I've always loved to take things apart and see how they worked. Anyway, along the way, I've learned about the whole gray market tractor thing, and the B7000 seems to have had a smaller production run than most of its contemporaries. I've been slowly gathering bits and pieces of information, like finding out which parts cross over to models that were sold in North America. I'm not a content creator like Diesel Creek or Squatch 253, but given the lack of information about this model of tractor, I figured I should take what I know and share it in case it helps someone else. Unfortunately, I've had Eileen for about a year and a half before I decided I should start recording, so all I have are stills. That means you get treated to a slideshow. Hopefully, it's more interesting than the ones your parents were forced to sit through after their friends returned from vacation. This photo was taken at a fuel stop on the way home from picking her up. As you can see, I got kind of a package deal. Eileen is on the left, next to her is her rototiller, and on the right is a VTEC V1 front-end loader and a parts tractor. The parts tractor is a V6000. I've since stolen a couple compatible parts like the clutch and a couple of switches, and the rest of it is sitting in the backyard. This summer, I plan to strip it, keep everything that fits the V7000, and then get rid of the rest. Actually, this is probably a good point to explain how Eileen got her name. The first summer, I blew one of the rear tires. The tire couldn't be repaired, and the shop didn't have a replacement in stock, so while I waited for one to be shipped in, I swapped out the wheel with one from the parts tractor. It wasn't until I got the spare wheel on that I discovered that the rear wheels on a B6000 are smaller than the ones on a B7000. This meant the tractor had a noticeable list to starboard for a few days. The list remained, to a lesser extent, even after the tire was replaced, since the original paddle tires had been out of production for who knows how long, and the most aggressive ag tread I could get was just a wee bit smaller. This photo was taken the day after, where I'm putting together the parts necessary to get her running. The first problem was that the clutch didn't work. Pressing down on the clutch made a bunch of noise, but it didn't actually disengage. After that, there was a bunch of little things. The glow plugs weren't hooked up. The starter switch was a bit of a hack. The oil pressure sensor wasn't connected to anything. And I was going to have to give her a full service because I had no idea when the filters or fluids were last changed. My foot's in the picture to give you an idea of just how small this tractor is. Here, I've split the chassis in order to get to the clutch. By the way, this was the first time I'd ever split a tractor, and it was definitely a learning process. I didn't have any lifting equipment, so I supported the rear half on jack stands and rolled the front half away with the help of a handle I bolted to the front of the frame. This let me push up or down to keep the center of balance over the front axle. However, because the axle is mounted on a pivot and the steering was disconnected, as soon as the front half detached, I didn't really have any control over it. This was especially fun when trying to line it up to put it back together. I didn't have a shop manual, and in fact I still don't, but the process is almost the same as for any other four-wheel drive tractor of the same vintage, like the B6000 or the B7100. And if you're mechanically inclined, it's pretty straightforward. On the left, you can see the clutch that I pulled from Eileen. On the right, the clutch I removed from the parts tractor. At this point, it was obvious why the clutch didn't work. In the image on the right, you can see the three levers in the center where the release bearing presses down to disengage the clutch. In the image on the left, those levers are completely worn away. Thankfully, the two clutches are identical parts, so I just installed the one from the parts tractor. A year and a half on, it still works fine. The two friction discs had almost the same amount of wear, so I just used the thicker one. By the way, a bit of half-inch PEX does a pretty good job of an alignment tool. Here she is, all strapped down for her first trip. By this point, I'd replaced the clutch, installed the glow plug starter switch from the parts tractor, installed the front end loader, and replaced all the fluids and filters. The oil filter is still readily available. I grabbed a Wix filter from my local auto parts store. I found the fuel filters on Amazon. The manual calls for SAE 30 weight engine oil, but since I'm using modern oils, I used 5W30. I would have expected a 40 weight oil for this engine, but maybe the forces on the bearings are lower because the engine is smaller and doesn't have as high of a compression as modern diesels. Anyway, A year and a half in, and there's no forbidden glitter, and all the engine parts have stayed where they're supposed to be. I put universal tractor fluid in the transmission, since it's working as gear oil and hydraulic fluid. I did find out the following winter that this oil is too thick to work in the cold. I'd have to leave the tractor idling for like a half an hour with the PTO running in order to get enough heat into the oil for the hydraulics to work. After some research, I found the oil I was using was equal to about 10W30 in viscosity, and I switched to a synthetic blend with a weight of 5W30. So far, I haven't had any problems with hydraulics in the cold. Eileen's first trip uncovered some problems that needed attention. Here, I've got the front right hub assembly torn apart to fix a leaky shaft seal. The front drive axle has a final drive reduction, I think it's 2-to-1, which increases ground clearance and the torque to the wheels. There's a better way to disassemble the front hub, but I didn't know that at the time and ended up disconnecting the entire steering knuckle. Here's the final drive, all ripped apart on the bench. If you count the holes, you can see there's one missing at the bottom of the housing. This is because the housing was broken at some point in the past and was mended with fiberglass and resin. I eventually replaced the entire housing with one from the parts tractor. They're compatible, but they're not exactly the same. The only difference is that the drain plugs and the mounting bolts are a different size. All the gears and bearings are exactly the same. The bearings would originally have all been open ball bearings, since this case is supposed to be full of gear oil. But someone's been in here. Some of the bearings have been replaced with modern sealed units. While Eileen was in the shop, I got some other things done. You can see the factory light switch on the left of the panel. That was eventually removed and discarded. At the bottom of the panel is a fuse panel that I added so I could add some additional lights. The factory headlights were beyond help, and I picked up some LED work lights from Princess Auto. Additionally, whatever fuse protection this tractor may have had at the factory was long gone, so I wanted some overcurrent protection for the glow plugs and the starter, etc. Behind the B7000 logo is the voltage regulator. The tractor has a generator attached to the engine that produces AC, whose voltage and frequency varies depending on the engine speed. The regulator takes this and turns it into nice, clean, well, cleanish DC for charging the battery. There's a second AC output on the generator for the headlights, like you find in a modern riding lawnmower or snowblower. But since I'm using LEDs, this line is dead-ended under the hood somewhere. That little lever next to the steering column is the compression release. If you pull it out, it cracks the exhaust valves open. And this stops the engine from building compression. You can use it during a cold start to make it easier for the starter to turn the engine over. And you can use it to build oil pressure without starting the engine, or you can pull it while the engine is running to shut it down. The little chrome donut is the glow plug indicator. There's a piece of wire inside the hole that glows when the glow plugs are energized, or at least it's supposed to. On mine, it doesn't anymore. Below that is the glow plug/start switch. There's no fancy glow plug timer like new engines have. The label above the switch tells you how long to hold the glow plugs on depending on what the air temperature is. When the switch is turned to the start position, the starter and the glow plugs are engaged at the same time. The oil pressure light is an LED that I added. I don't know anything about the history of this engine, and it made me all kinds of uncomfortable if the oil pressure sensor wasn't connected. The two holes are for the horn button and the key switch. I've since filled the latter one with an isolation switch, and I've yet to make the horn work. In addition to the rototiller, Eileen came with most of the parts for a 3-point hitch. I say most because there was no place to attach a top link. I've since discovered that this is called a Category 0 3-point hitch. I ended up welding a point onto the seat bracket so I could attach a top link, turning it into a Category 1 hitch. I've since got hold of a parts book for the B7000 and I've learned that the Category 1 hitch was available as a kit, and it comes with a top link bracket. However, the lower link arms in the diagrams don't look the same as the ones I have, so I suspect this kit was from a third party. Anyway, I figured a back blade would be really helpful for grading and snow clearing and a bunch of other things. Little did I know that it would also teach me lots about dynamic forces and bracing and give me lots of welding practice. The blade itself is a piece of 10mm wall pipe, and the rest is scrap metal I had lying around. I was in the process of building a pole shed in my backyard when I got Eileen, and while she wasn't originally part of this plan, she paid for herself quite quickly. Here you can see her lifting the shed frames into position. I attached clamp-on forks to the bucket and then extended them with some pipe topped by leftovers from the blade so I could stand up the frames, wiggle them into position over the footings, and then set them down. This picture was taken after the first frame was up and braced, after I'd removed the straps that held the frame to the tractor during the lifting process. At this point, I had screwed around with the adjustments for the compression release and realized that I now had to set all that right before I accidentally killed the engine. I mentioned it earlier, but the compression release works by holding the exhaust valves open so that the engine can't build compression. There's an adjustment that determines how much the valve is held open, and since this is a diesel engine, and diesel engines have high compression, I was worried that if the compression release pushed the valve too far open, it would hit the piston. when the piston got to top dead center, and that, my friends, would ruin my day. So far, this engine has operated beautifully. No blow-by, no oil consumption, no leaks, and I wasn't about to let my negligence kill it. Here's the inside of the valve cover. Note the rubber seal, so there's no gasket to deal with. The compression release mechanism is at the top of the cover in this picture. There's a lever on top that rotates when the compression release is activated. This rotation turns a cam that pushes down on a button. The button sits on top of the exhaust rocker arm and pushes down on the valve. The instructions for adjusting the slack in the mechanism are to put the piston in top dead center on the compression stroke, pull the compression release, turn the adjusting screw until it contacts the rocker arm, and then turn it 1.5 times more. Since I couldn't feel the screw contact the rocker arm, and the whole thing felt pretty floppy in general, I thought it safest to take it apart and see how it worked. I was able to tighten everything up, and then if I remember correctly, I put the valve cover back on and used a borescope to verify my adjustments. I must have done it right, because at the end of the day, I had not shattered any pistons or bent any valves. After I found the weak spot in version 1, I altered my design slightly. I replaced the pivot point with a tube-in-a-tube design that distributed the force over a larger area. I also added a bunch of bracing, but I wasn't done underestimating how much force was being exerted on this thing. The original joystick handle for the loader's hydraulic control was lost to the mists of time, and by the time I got Eileen, there was a short chunk of threaded rod standing in. Here, I've replaced the chunk of threaded rod with a piece of 10mm rod with a bolt welded to the bottom. This lever is longer than what was there, and sported a knob on the end so I could stop putting holes in my hand. The knob is 3D printed using TPU, and so far it's held up nicely. In this picture, you can also see the joystick boot that I 3D printed to cover the hydraulic spools and the shift knob and boot on the main gear selector. Unfortunately, the rubber boot on the gear selector had split and failed, and the transmission oil escapes and gets all over everything if that boot isn't there. I'm having less luck with TPU for the shift boots, as the constant motion eventually splits them. However, for the cost of TPU, I can just replace them every spring. Eileen spent the summer moving dirt. Lots and lots of dirt. Somewhere along the line, I neglected to keep an eye on some things I should have been watching, like how tight the bolts were that held the front final drive housings together. This is where I learned not to reuse spring washers. The case on the right side had started to separate, which caused this gear to be loaded unnaturally, hence the chipped teeth. Fortunately, this was the only damage, and I had a spare or two from the parts tractor. This is also the time when I decided to experiment with 3D printed gaskets. RTV is a real pain, with the smearing it on, getting it in places it shouldn't be, partially assembling everything, waiting for it to cure, etc. And I ended up pulling apart both final drives to replace another leaky shaft seal. So this time I sealed one side with RTV gasket maker and the other side with a gasket 3D printed from TPU. So far, both sides are still holding oil. Up until this point, I had assumed that since the engine was water-cooled, that it had a water pump. Well, this is the part where I learned that I was wrong. All summer, I'd been losing coolant. It would spray out of the engine somewhere while I was running the tractor. I figured I had a leak somewhere, but I was able to pressure test the radiator and it passed with flying colors. I eventually figured out that the coolant was boiling and coming out through the radiator cap, so I figured the water pump must be faulty. I stuck a borescope down the water outlet on the engine, and I didn't see anything resembling an impeller, so I decided to pull this off, only to find that there wasn't an impeller because there wasn't a water pump. I hit the books and the internet at this point, and I discovered that this engine was cooled by convection and was never supposed to have a water pump. I also found out that it was supposed to have a whistle attached to the overflow line on the radiator, and the operator monitored the engine temperature by taking a break when they heard the whistle. So the good news was the cooling system was operating as designed and wasn't defective. The bad news was that running it this way was going to cost me an arm and a leg in coolant, and I wasn't about to start running water in the cooling system. It's corroded enough in there as it is, not to mention that it would virtually guarantee that I'd forget and wind up with a cracked block in the winter. My current plan is to add a coolant temperature sensor and a gauge so I can take a break before the coolant boils over. After my success with TPU gaskets on the front final drive, I had one more oil leak to fix. This is the left front axle removed from the front differential. Thankfully, this was pretty easy to remove. Once the 8 bolts holding the housing together are removed, the axle just slips out, no fighting with C-clips or gear pullers. I took some measurements, and after a quick whiz wheel of the mating surfaces, I reassembled it with a freshly printed TPU gasket. Well, that brings us to today. After a year and a half of ownership, I guess I can give a little bit of a review in case you're looking at buying one of these. First of all, it's easy to transport. The book says the tractor weighs about 830-ish kilograms. I think with the loader and the back blade, it's still under 1,000. Despite being built for the Japanese market in the early 70s, it does have a PTO and a 3-point hitch that are compatible with today's implements. It's got a fully mechanical diesel engine, so it's easy to work on. I think it's rated at like 13 horsepower and the top speed is 3,000 RPM. No turbo, no electronics. Unfortunately, her lightweight also means you got to be very careful lifting with the loader, especially if you want to keep your pants clean. The loader is powered by the onboard hydraulic pump, so the flow rate's kind of slow, but I don't really mind. Makes it harder to break things, and at the end of the day, I'm not really in a rush. This one has a geared transmission, which I think is a little tougher than a hydrostatic drive. I prefer it, even if it's a little harder to operate. Anyway, as I use Eileen and as I do the maintenance and repairs, I hope to bring you along.